Everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray. What I do here is attempt to answer a question from a viewer or listener or reader, and they send me questions via email or by postcard or commenting on a previous podcast or anywhere they can find it, really, and we'll find those questions and attempt to answer them. And I attempt to answer them in about 10 minutes. Sometimes I go over, seldom under. And of course, I get a lot of questions from patrons, and you can back us on Patreon/Ancient Warfare Podcast. And you can back us at one of the three levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion, $1, $5, and $10. Today's question, plurals, questions, come from David. He's asked 4 questions, which I will attempt to answer and hopefully not go over my 10-minute slot. But I think I can answer them all because I think my answers to a couple of them are short. He says, "Hi, Murray. Your episode on Lost Legions reminded me of 4 related questions that I was hoping you could address. 1, 2, 3, or all 4. 1. Were the legions largely or even completely replaced by the Foederati by the 7th century AD? We do get mentions of legions. The word legiones does occur with increasing irregularity. I believe we've done a podcast in the past on the last mentioned legion, which is in the 6th century. So you find the word disappears as a name for identifying a unit. And it gets instead, I mean, it does occur in later sources talking about legions. So you get medieval 12th century discussions of King Arthur's armies and the armies that he's fighting, and they have legions in them. So there is the word, but the units themselves don't seem to refer to them as that. Foederati also disappears by the 7th century, so it's not really replacement as such, that there are mercenary groups and they're not called that, but then they are called that again in the 9th century, so it's kind of these phrases and terms coming back in. So I would say that, yes, legions are completely gone, but they're not necessarily replaced by Foederati, or they're not called Foederati. Whether they were made up of the same and similar kinds of mercenary, allied, barbarian troops is, a moot point. Maurice's Strategicon is sort of talking about the using loyal troops, and it's unclear if it's all just actual armies or using mercenaries. So that's the first one. I think legions are gone, but not replaced by Foederati. The second question: what do we know about the ethnic makeup of the armies that fought for pagan Rome in the wars of the 1st century BC and AD, largely legionaries from southern Europe, compared to the armies that fought for the Byzantine Rome in the 7th century, largely barbarians, including Heraclius's reconquest of Jerusalem in 628 from the Persian Sassanid Empire? Okay, so the ethnic makeup of the armies in Rome in the 1st century BC and AD, largely volunteers of Roman citizens from Italy, and then the Romanized provinces, Rhaetia and Noricum, Spain, Gaul. And so you start to get an increase. Obviously, by the 2nd century AD, everyone's a citizen, so you still get citizen legions in that. Now, of course, ethnically speaking, they're quite diverse, so you can get legions from people who are from those different countries and cultures ethnically. However, by the Byzantine Roman Empire, of course, they just called themselves Romans. We call them Byzantines. What you got is you've still got a core of local troops, but they are increasingly disparaged as being career soldiers, not actual fighters. And you do have a increase in the number of men who the commanders employ as mercenaries loyal to them, and also as Foederati, which is the treaty organization. And indeed, when it's in Greek, it's Symmachoi, which is a mercenary treaty from much earlier in Greek history. So they're mercenary agreements with groups of soldiers, and they come from a vastly diverse area, which one of your next questions actually talks about as well. So what you find is, yes, you've got these groups of barbarian Foederati. Laiti is another name for them, but they're Gauls, they're Germanic, they're Hunnic, they're Thracian, from all sorts of different cultures. And you've also got various Arab tribes as well in the east especially. But that basically leads into your third question. So I think at all times, the makeup of these armies was diverse culturally and ethnically, but it shifts and changes over time. Now, question 3. Do you have a view either way on the argument made most compellingly by Tom Holland in his 2014 book, In the Shadow of the Sword, that the Byzantine Roman army of the early 7th century was made up largely of fighters from the southern Levant and northern Arabia, where the Ghassanids came from? So I would disagree with that he's making a point about the Eastern army. Yes, there are Eastern army Foederati who are obviously not really going beyond they're not really going beyond the east. So you've got, and I apologize if I pronounce these wrong, you've got the Lakhmids, you've got the Tanukids, the Banu Amela, and the Ghassanids, who are in east, and they're Arab tribes, and they are being used in the Eastern army. But at the same time, the Eastern army is using a lot of Gauls, the Heruli, the Lombards, the Gepids, the Bulgars. They're using Huns, sometimes called Massagetai. So they're very much multicultural and multi-ethnic, previous answer. And so I don't think you could say that they are largely going to be from the east. I think they're all over the shop. And obviously after Belisarius defeats the Vandals, you find Vandal Foederati units that have been transported within the Roman Empire in the Eastern armies. So I think that in that sense, you can't say that it's predominantly made up of fighters from southern Levant and northern Arabia. I think that there are elements of those. And of course, one of the things that happens in Roman warfare is they don't try and generally use the soldiers employed or hired from a particular area to fight in that area. Marcus Aurelius does do that, and it causes all sorts of issues because those soldiers suddenly start evening scores of their own cultural background, so that it's not a disciplined army. Whereas when you look at what the other commanders are doing, Belisarius and things, they're using Germanic and Hunnic Foederati in Vandal North Africa or in Italy, for instance, so they're not evening scores from their own cultural background. So I would say that that's a no for me. Sorry, David and Tom Holland. And 4, could Arab forces that formerly made up the Foederati have declared independence from Rome in the 3rd decade of the 7th century and ultimately have conquered the Levant from the Romans in the 630s before engaging in civil war amongst themselves and descendants of the Lakhmids who fought on behalf of the Sassanid Empire 3 decades later? In other words, might Muhammad and his original followers all have been former Foederati who turned against their former Eastern Roman clients, much like the Gothic barbarians did in the former Western Roman clients a couple of centuries earlier? No. I think the interesting thing there is that, again, I don't believe that the Byzantine army was largely made up of these Arabic tribes. Those tribes that do make up part of the Byzantine army are not the core of Muhammad's army. And I must admit, I'm not an expert on the early Islamic conquests in that sense, but certainly in terms of the area, it's the closest area to the Eastern Roman Empire that they employ. And so what you find is that it's a different area. It's also, of course, a question of unity. And that's one of the most amazing things that Muhammad does. He unifies, and that unified conquest is what defeats what has become a disunified Roman Empire. So that what you find is the major problem with the Byzantine reconquest of the Roman Empire, for instance, in North Africa, and what's attempted in Sicily and Italy, is that even though they do achieve some great things, it all falls apart very quickly because there's a lack of unity and there's a lack of pulling on the same direction in the boat, the ship of state, if I can quote Plato. So I think in that sense, that's not where the early Islamic conquests come from, but they come from a unified Arabic, what's the word? It's not a confederation. It's not there's a unification that occurs there that isn't present in the Roman Empire at the time, or the Byzantine Empire. So that, I think, those are my feelings on those things, which is more no's than yeses. I apologize, but I think in that sense, I'm going to recap. So no, legions are gone, but not replaced by Foederati because they've gone too. Ethnic makeup always diverse. regardless of when that shifts and changes. I don't think that the armies of the Byzantine Roman East were largely made up of fighters from the southern Levant and northern Arabia. There's too many Germanic and other groups that we know of. And I don't believe that the Arab forces that began the first conquests were former Roman or Byzantine Foederati. So there you go, David. Sorry for less agreement than you might have wanted. Anyway, that is another Ancient Warfare Answers. Join me again for another question that I will attempt to answer in 10 minutes. Thanks. Bye.